The New York Slave Conspiracy. New York, winter 1741, a city waiting to explode. Welcome to Historic Crimes, where you get the true story of events that have happened in the past which helped shape the history of the world that we are living in. Before we begin, please click the subscribe button below so you will get more from us. Now relax and enjoy. The wind screamed through crooked alleyways, carrying with it the stench of rot and despair. Wooden houses huddled together like frightened animals. Ice rimmed the harbor, and ships creaked as if whispering secrets. This was a city poisoned by fear long before the fires came. White New Yorkers looked at the enslaved population with suspicion, dread, and a kind of trembling hatred. Every black face on the street was a reminder, unspoken but always present, of the revolt that had scarred the city 3 decades earlier. People slept lightly, doors were bolted, rumors were currency, and beneath all of it, enslaved men and women walked silently, carrying the weight of someone else's fear on their shoulders. The night the sky burned, it began with the governor's mansion at Fort George. A flame flickered at the edge of the roofline, timid at first, like a child playing with fire. Then it grew, hungry, furious, savage. The sky turned orange. Smoke coiled upward like a serpent. Crowds gathered, shivering in the cold. Someone said it, a man muttered. "It must be the slaves," another whispered. No one had evidence. But in a city drowning in suspicion, proof wasn't needed. The next week came another fire, then another and another. Each time the bells rang, people ran into the streets with buckets and trembling hands, staring at the flames as if staring into their own graves. Something tightened in the city's chest. Fear was now a living thing. The fires, sparks in the snow. The first fire did not roar, it hissed. A thin line of smoke curled from the roof of the governor's mansion at Fort George, almost shy, almost delicate. But in minutes, the flame revealed its true nature, wild, ravenous, determined to consume. Guards ran through the courtyard, shouting. Buckets were passed from trembling hands to trembling hands. Snow melted beneath the heat. Sparks landed on wool coats and burned holes before anyone noticed. The winter sky glowed orange as the building collapsed inward with a groan like a dying beast. Someone in the crowd gasped, "Arson!" Another voice hissed, "The slaves did it." No one saw anything, no one had evidence. But fear is a storyteller, and the crowd believed its tale. A city on edge, New York was not large in 1741. Its people lived close, too close. When someone coughed in the next room, you heard it. When someone whispered a rumor, it spread in minutes. When fear entered a house, it seeped into the entire street. In the taverns, men hunched over ale mugs, muttering about conspiracies. Women crossed themselves as they passed enslaved men. Children were warned not to look into the eyes of dangerous blacks. The city had become a powder keg, and the fires were only beginning. The second blaze, 2 weeks later, a warehouse near the waterfront erupted in flames. This time the fire started in broad daylight. Smoke billowed upward, thick and black, drawing the entire neighborhood into the street. "Another fire!" a voice shouted. The crowd gathered, tense, breath steaming in the cold air. "It's them," someone whispered, "the Africans, they're rising." No one questioned how a group of enslaved men, exhausted, watched, restricted, punished, could mastermind a coordinated attack. Fear made explanations unnecessary. Panic takes root within days. A stable caught fire, then a shop, then a barn behind a private home, then a merchant storehouse. Some fires were small, some burned entire structures to the ground. The bells rang constantly, their clanging echoing through narrow streets. Every time the bells rang, people ran not just to fight the fire, but to fight their own terror. The enslaved population walked through the streets with lowered eyes, aware of the stairs burning into their backs. They had not lit the fires, but they would pay for them. Old fears returned. The white population remembered the revolt of 1712, they remembered the blood, they remembered the screams, they remembered the gallows that had once stood in the center of the city. To them, the fires were not accidents, they were warnings. In the minds of fearful people, coincidence becomes conspiracy, and so New York convinced itself that another revolt was imminent, a nightmare rising from the ashes of every burning building. The rumors, the city's fear grew teeth. In taverns, someone claimed a slave confessed to starting a fire. In marketplaces, people whispered that dozens of enslaved men were gathering at night. In churches, preachers warned that God was punishing the colony for allowing dangerous heathens into their homes. Rumors spread faster than flames. By the end of March, New York did not simply believe something was happening, New York knew it or believed it did. In the eyes of the terrified, certainty and paranoia look very much the same. The hunt begins. Mayor Clark called an emergency council. Justice Horsmanden, stern-faced and ambitious, paced the chamber like a man standing on the edge of opportunity. "We are under attack," he declared. "We must root out this conspiracy." Soldiers were deployed. Night patrols roamed the streets. Owners were ordered to report any suspicious behavior, meant speaking, laughing, standing still, looking tired, looking alive. Fear makes criminals out of shadows, and soon, New York was full of shadows. A city ready to accuse anyone. By April, the enslaved community could feel the change in the air, a coldness that was not winter's, an anger that was not righteous, a suspicion sharp enough to cut. People avoided them, watched them, waited for them to slip, to fall, to speak out of turn. And in quiet corners of the city, enslaved men whispered to each other in fear, "We are being hunted." They were right. The fires had opened the door, now the accusations would flood through it. The moment before collapse, the fires eventually stopped, but the fear they ignited never did. The city was restless, tense, waiting for a spark that would shift the panic into action. The social powder keg, the New York slave conspiracy of 1741, did not emerge from nowhere. The panic that consumed the city was built on long-standing, deeply rooted social tensions, fears, rivalries, and anxieties that had been festering for decades. By 1741, New York was a city where poverty, racial division, imperial war, and political instability collided. Any spark, literal or political, could have triggered an explosion. A city built on uneasy foundations, and New York's surprising dependence on slavery. Though often associated with the South, in 1741 New York had one of the highest enslaved populations in the northern colonies. About 1 in 5 residents was enslaved. Many enslaved people worked as craftsmen, dockworkers, coopers, carpenters, and servants. They were deeply integrated into the city economy. This created a tense dynamic. Whites depended on enslaved Africans' labor, yet feared their growing numbers and resilience. Memories of the 1712 slave revolt. Just 29 years earlier, New York had suffered a violent slave uprising. Enslaved Africans set fire to a building, attacked whites who came to extinguish it. The revolt left several dead. 70+ enslaved people were arrested, many executed. The memory had not faded. To white New Yorkers, another uprising was not only possible, it was expected. Poverty, competition, and social jealousy, poor whites versus enslaved workers. An unusual feature of New York at this time, poor, free whites competed directly with enslaved Africans for jobs. Enslaved New Yorkers rented out their labor, worked for wages, which they often gave to owners, had valuable urban skills. This created resentment among poor whites who believed enslaved labor depressed wages. Tavern culture and interracial spaces. Taverns like John Hewson's became mixing grounds for poor whites, enslaved men, free blacks, sailors, transients. To elite New Yorkers, interracial social spaces were disorderly, dangerous, signs of collapsing racial boundaries, so when fires broke out, the authorities immediately blamed these tavern networks. Crime, disorder, and a reputation for thievery. Hewson's Tavern, a symbol of fear. John Hewson's Tavern was infamous, frequented by enslaved laborers, a hub for stolen goods, a place where class lines blurred. Authorities believed Hewson encouraged theft, disorder, racial boundary crossing. Thus, once the conspiracy panic began, Hewson and his associates were natural targets. The war with Spain and anti-Catholic terror, the War of Jenkins' Ear, 1739 to 1748. Britain was at war with Spain, and New York was on high alert. The colonial government feared that Spanish agents or Catholic missionaries could encourage enslaved Africans to revolt, promise them freedom, or use them as agents of sabotage. This fear was not new. Spain had previously offered freedom to enslaved Africans who fled British colonies, armed them in Florida, used them in military defense. Thus, to New Yorkers in 1741, a Spanish, Catholic, black conspiracy seemed plausible. Rumors of Spanish emissaries, long before the fires, whispers circulated that Spanish ships were approaching, prisoners of war had escaped, Catholic priests were hiding among slaves. These rumors fed the hysteria that followed. Economic fragility and the fear of urban fire. New York's wooden city was crowded, built largely of wood, filled with narrow alleys, vulnerable to fire. Even a single flame could destroy blocks. In 1741, the city had no professional fire brigade, limited firefighting technology. Thus, multiple fires over a few weeks felt like coordinated arson. A harsh winter and desperation. The winter of 1740 to 1741 was brutal. Food shortages, higher crime, freezing temperatures, rising discontent among enslaved and poor residents. In such conditions, any sudden disaster could push the public into panic. Racial ideology and the psychology of fear. White anxiety about black agency. White New Yorkers lived in constant contradiction. They relied on black labor yet feared black autonomy and intelligence. Thus, the idea that enslaved people might organize a secret plan felt both terrifying and believable. The power of rumor. In a city with no newspapers for the poor, no police force, heavy reliance on gossip, rumor could spread faster than fact. Once people began whispering, "The slaves are rising again," it became a self-reinforcing prophecy. The stage set for panic. By early 1741, New York was a city, traumatized by past rebellion, grinding through economic hardship, divided by race, class, and religion, suspicious of taverns and interracial alliances, on edge because of war. All that was needed was a trigger. The cluster of fires in March and April 1741 became that trigger, and the social powder keg finally exploded. The firestorm begins, the blazes, the panic, and the birth of a conspiracy. By the spring of 1741, New York City was stretched thin politically, economically, and socially. The winter had been brutal, the city was crowded with wooden structures, and tensions between classes and races simmered beneath the surface. All it took was a wave of unexpected fires to turn fear into hysteria. The first blaze, March 18, 1741 in Fort George, symbol of colonial authority. On a cold March morning, the colony's most important building, the governor's mansion inside Fort George, burst into flames. The fire destroyed the chapel, ruined government records, threatened nearby armory buildings, endangered the governor's residence. In a city terrified of fire, this was catastrophic enough. But what made it unforgettable was the way the fire started. Suspicious circumstances. Witnesses claimed they saw a puff of smoke rising from the mansion, flames spreading unnaturally fast, enslaved laborers acting strangely. Whether these accounts were real or influenced by racial anxiety remains debated. But in 1741, suspicion immediately turned toward enslaved workers assigned to the fort. The governor's reaction. Acting Governor George Clark, shaken and displaced from his home, declared the fire suspicious. His personal loss fueled his belief that this fire was not an accident, but design. This assumption would shape everything that followed. The second fire, the panic deepens. Just 9 days later, another fire broke out, this time in a warehouse near the water. A strange pattern, within moments. Another nearby building caught fire, then another, then smoke rose from a stable. The city's fire bell rang violently, and citizens poured into the streets shouting, "It's a plot! The slaves are burning the town!" Whether or not the fires were linked, the pattern looked intentional. Rumors spread like flames. In a matter of hours, rumors multiplied. A black man ran from the fire holding a burning brand. "I saw slaves laughing as the flames rose. The Spanish are helping them." None of these claims could be verified. But in a fearful city, rumors became evidence. A city under siege. Between March and April 1741, more than a dozen fires erupted across the city, roofs of warehouses caught fire, a shed blazed near Broad Street, the governor's new barn burned, smoke appeared in homes near the docks. The fires weren't large, but they were constant. And every one added fuel to the idea of a coordinated rebellion. The fire bell as a weapon of fear, normally a tool of safety, became a symbol of dread. Residents reported heart-pounding panic whenever the bell rang, women fainting, men racing into the streets armed. The bell no longer signaled danger, but it signaled conspiracy. Enslaved workers under immediate suspicion. Authorities quickly assumed that enslaved laborers, working near the governor's house, hired out across the city, known to gather in taverns, were responsible for the blazes. The logic is flawed, as it went like this: enslaved people work near every fire site. Therefore, they must have set them. In reality, enslaved people worked everywhere in the city. But suspicion focused entirely on them. As panic grew, people looked for an easy explanation. They found one in John Hewson, a poor tavern keeper, his wife Sarah, his teenage servant Peggy Carey. Hewson's tavern had long been accused of harboring thieves, poor whites, and enslaved workers. Now it became, in the public mind, the headquarters of the plot. The Negro Tavern, the den of conspirators. Still, there was no real evidence. In April 1741, the turning point, the straw fire that broke the city's nerves. In early April, a pile of straw outside a home ignited unexpectedly. Normally this would be dismissed as careless disposal. But in 1741, in a panicked city, people screamed, "The slaves have set another fire." Crowds seized several enslaved men on the spot. Some were beaten, some barely escaped mob violence. The arrests began as authorities arrested enslaved workers from the fort, enslaved men seen near any fire, customers of Hewson's tavern, anyone rumored to be involved. Within days, more than 100 people were in custody. New York's small jail could not hold the growing number of accused conspirators. The city converted storage rooms, basements, even private homes into makeshift detention centers. The panic had become a machine that could no longer be stopped. By mid-April, the public had accepted a story without evidence. The enslaved population, led by Hewson and coordinated by Catholic Spanish agents, had started a massive rebellion that began with fire. It was a perfect storm of racial fear, anti-Catholic prejudice, class hostility, wartime paranoia, economic anxiety, collective trauma. Once this narrative took hold, the legal system followed. Trials began and executions followed. And New York descended into one of the most tragic injustices in colonial American history. The Inquisition begins, trials, coercion, and the machinery of fear. By April 1741, New York was no longer a city seeking truth, it was a city seeking culprits. With jails overflowing, fire alarms ringing weekly, and citizens convinced a rebellion was underway, the colonial government transformed into an engine of investigation. What followed was not a search for justice but an inquisition, shaped by fear, racial ideology, political ambition, and the desperate need to impose order on chaos. The Extraordinary Court is formed as the governor demands action. Acting Governor George Clark, still reeling from the loss of his mansion in the first fire, called for an aggressive response. He ordered a special tribunal, expanded powers for prosecutors, swift action against suspected arsonists. Clark believed or convinced himself that only a severe example will prevent the destruction of the city. City officials' close ranks, Mayor John Kruger, Recorder Daniel Horsmanden, and other city magistrates formed the backbone of the investigation. Horsmanden, in particular, recorded testimony, managed interrogations, designed the narrative, published the official account. He became both investigator and historian, shaping the story for centuries. The legal landscape was built for conviction as the enslaved people had few rights. Under colonial law, enslaved defendants could not testify in their own defense, could not demand legal counsel, could not compel witnesses, had no jury of peers. They were judged entirely by white men, influenced by fear, pressured by public expectation, emotionally primed for guilt. Rewarding cooperation, punishing silence, authorities offered enslaved suspects freedom, financial rewards, protection if they confessed or implicated others. But the cost of refusing to confess was whipping, torture, death. Confessions were not freely given, they were extracted. The court of fear. By early summer of 1741, the trials had moved beyond logic, beyond evidence, beyond reality itself. The city was no longer trying to understand what happened, it was trying to confirm what it already believed, that a vast, coordinated plot involving enslaved Africans, poor whites, tavern owners, thieves, and Spanish Catholics had been secretly preparing to burn New York to the ground. Mary Burton and the expansion of the conspiracy. The girl who became the key to everything, a 16-year-old servant with immense power. A poor teenager working as an indentured servant in Houston's tavern, became the star witness of the trials. At first, she said nothing. Then, under pressure and after realizing confessions produced rewards, she began naming names. The alleged rebel plan, according to Mary Burton in coerced testimonies, the supposed plan was, burn the entire city, kill all white men who resisted, take white women as wives, seize the city arsenal, join with Spanish forces, establish a black-controlled New York. It was a fantasy, but a fantasy the court desperately wanted to believe. The story was so believable in 1741 because it reflected every racial fear, every religious prejudice, every class anxiety, every wartime suspicion. The conspiracy was not real, but the fears it represented were. If you think she is lying which lead to the killing and you are against it, click the subscribe button. Her testimony rapidly expanded. Initially she accused 3 enslaved men, the Houston family. Then her claims widened, 12 enslaved men, dozens more from the docks, Houston's poor white customers, alleged Spanish agents, and anyone she thought the judges wanted to hear. Mary Burton's testimony became a self-feeding machine. The more she said, the more the court believed, the more she was praised, the more she added. Fear made her the most powerful person in the city. Confessions were manufactured through whipping, threats, and implied violence. Suspects were offered a choice: confess and accuse others or face execution. Many enslaved men held out for weeks, insisting they were innocent. But after repeated interrogations, most broke. Some were whipped, some were isolated, some were threatened with the gallows in front of other prisoners. False confessions spread like infection. Once the first enslaved men confessed under pressure, the pattern repeated. A suspect named 5 others, those 5 named 10 more, those 10 named 20 more. The court mistook these overlapping accusations as proof of a vast conspiracy. The first executions. In April, May 1741, Caesar and Prince, the ringleaders. The first to die were 2 enslaved men, Caesar and Prince, accused of theft, possible arson, associating with Houston. There was no hard evidence, but fear demanded sacrifices. The death of John and Sarah Houston, the Houston's poor whites who socialized with enslaved men, were seen as race traitors. Authorities viewed interracial friendship as suspicious, dangerous, a threat to social order. They were tried, convicted, executed by hanging. Their deaths intensified the panic. Peggy Carey, the servant who saved herself through betrayal. Peggy, a white teenage servant, faced the same fate. She saved herself by accusing the Houstons, accusing enslaved men who frequented the tavern, supporting Mary Burton's story. Her testimony was rewarded and her life was spared. The court learned an important lesson: if you want to survive, accuse someone else. Public spectacle and social control, executions as warnings. Each hanging was treated as a display of authority, a message to enslaved workers, a reassurance to frightened whites. Gallows were erected in public spaces, crowds gathered. Officials repeated the message: this is what happens to conspirators. Burnings at the stake. Some enslaved men were burned alive as a punishment reserved for crimes deemed treasonous. These horrific public executions intensified fear, convinced many that a real rebellion had existed, encouraged further accusations. Fear fed violence. Violence fed more fear. The investigation spirals out of control. By June 1741, the trials were no longer about fires. They were about maintaining white supremacy, suppressing interracial alliances, demonstrating political strength, proving the government could protect the city. The court demanded new names, and witnesses provided them. The machinery of panic grew larger and more irrational. The Inquisition had begun and the darkest phase was still to come. The court can no longer stop what it started. By midsummer, the panic had become too big to contain. Mary Burton's stories had justified dozens of arrests, triggered executions, turned rumor into legal fact, expanded the plot beyond reason, thrust New York into a frenzy of retribution. The judges had no choice now. They had created a monster. And the only way to prove their own competence was to keep feeding it. The executions multiply, hangings, burnings, in the height of the panic. By the summer of 1741, New York had fully entered a state of collective hysteria. The city's fears, fed by fires, rumors, and Mary Burton's testimony, now demanded action. The courts responded with a relentless campaign of punishment designed as both justice and spectacle, executions to satisfy fear, to intimidate the enslaved population, and to demonstrate the power of colonial authority. Burnings at the stake, escalation of horror, the worst punishments. Some enslaved men and women, accused of the most heinous acts, were burned alive. These executions were rare, intended to terrify, symbolically tied to the supposed arson plot. Historians estimate that at least 13 people suffered death by burning. Mary Burton's role intensifies, naming names. By this time, Mary Burton was unstoppable. She confirmed the guilt of suspects, she expanded her accusations, she identified new ringleaders. Her testimony directly led to more arrests, confessions extracted under torture, public executions. She had become the instrument of the court. Every word she spoke could be a death sentence. Coerced confessions create a chain reaction. Enslaved prisoners learn quickly. Confess and accuse others, temporary reprieve. Deny involvement, death. As more accused confessed under duress, the number of arrests exploded. By July 1741, dozens of enslaved people and poor whites had been executed or sentenced to punishment, and the city was in constant fear. Fear spread beyond the courts by social compliance through terror. Enslaved workers avoided all gatherings, taverns became monitored spaces, white citizens looked to neighbors for signs of rebellion, rumor became law, and the city itself became a prison of collective anxiety. Executions, the human toll as 13 were burned alive, 30 plus hanged and others whipped, fined, or banished. The enslaved population lived in terror, could trust no one, learned quickly that survival depended on reporting others. For the white population, anxiety never fully disappeared. Any small incident was assumed to be part of the plot. Fear became normalized. The court's blindness to reality. Despite mounting evidence that many confessions were coerced, rumors had created fictional conspirators, fires may have been accidental. The courts pressed on. Officials argued, better to punish the innocent than risk the city burning again. This reasoning highlights the supremacy of fear over reason, where punishment validates paranoia rather than truth. By late summer 1741, fires had stopped, panic was exhausting itself, the jails were nearly emptying. Yet, the executions had cemented authority, social hierarchies were reinforced, white citizens believed their lives had been saved by swift justice. The city returned to relative normalcy, but scars remained psychological, social, and racial. Reinforced racial control, slave patrols and curfews increased, interracial socializing became highly restricted, urban enslaved workers faced harsher supervision. Acting Governor Clark strengthened his authority, judges and magistrates gained prestige. For centuries, the events were minimized. Modern historians view it as one of the most extreme miscarriages of justice in colonial America. Aftermath and legacy, how the 1741 conspiracy shaped New York. By the autumn of 1741, the flames had died, the hangings had ended, and the city of New York tried to return to normal. Yet, the effects of the panic, hysteria, and executions left lasting scars on the social, legal, and racial fabric of the city. Authorities quietly acknowledged the limits of their campaign, though no official apology was ever issued. The teenage servant who had fueled the hysteria, received monetary reward, gained temporary social elevation, remained protected by the city officials. Her testimony had saved her, but it also made her a symbol of how hysteria and fear could turn one person into a weapon. Racial tensions deepened. The panic reinforced fear among white citizens. Enslaved populations were now treated with greater suspicion. Black and poor white alliances were strictly policed. Taverns, social gatherings, and urban meeting spots became tightly monitored. The city's elite used the hysteria to strengthen racial control and limit mobility among the enslaved. For both the enslaved and free population, fear and distrust became ingrained. Rumor and accusation replaced evidence in daily life. Families were torn apart, communities fractured. The events created a culture of constant vigilance and mutual suspicion that persisted for decades. Power consolidation. Governor George Clark and his allies benefited politically, demonstrated authority during crisis, gained the loyalty of elites fearful of rebellion, reinforced colonial law enforcement as a tool of racial and social control. Legal precedents. Courts accepted coerced confessions from enslaved people. Reliance on hearsay and witness testimony without corroboration increased. This set dangerous precedents for colonial justice in New York and other northern colonies. The law became more about control than fairness, particularly for enslaved populations. The event was forgotten. For decades, the 1741 conspiracy was underreported in historical accounts, was minimized in New York's colonial narrative, and became overshadowed by Southern slavery narratives in later Revolutionary history. Modern scholarship reveals the truth. Contemporary historians now view the conspiracy as largely fabricated, driven by fear, racial prejudice, and political motives. A tragic example of mass hysteria. The fires were likely accidental, the rebellion imagined, and the evidence coerced or falsified. Fear as a tool of control. The panic shows how hysteria can manipulate populations. Fear can justify violence and oppression. Single witnesses or rumors can have catastrophic effects. The human cost: at least 30 to 40 enslaved men and women were executed. 4 poor whites were executed. Families, communities, and social trust were destroyed. Legacy for New York: the city's racial hierarchies became stricter. Legal systems were adapted to enforce social order rather than justice. The memory of 1741 remains a cautionary tale of prejudice, panic, and unchecked authority. The New York slave conspiracy of 1741 is remembered today as one of the most extreme miscarriages of justice in colonial America, a story of fear overtaking reason, a grim reminder that society can unravel when paranoia, prejudice, and political ambition converge. From the first spark of a fire to the execution of innocent men and women, the events of 1741 demonstrate how panic can reshape an entire city, legally, socially, and morally. Even centuries later, the story challenges us to consider how quickly fear can overtake justice, and how easily innocent lives can be consumed by the machinery of paranoia. What do you think they did wrong which needs retribution and apologies to the Black community? Drop your suggestion in the comment section, and please don't forget to subscribe.